Our first reading today is from the prophet Isaiah, found in the Old Testament. For I am about to create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. But the serpent, its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord.
Easter Sunday worship starts with the proclamation of Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. And this, of course, is the central affirmation that is proclaimed in our Christian faith. It's the very center point of everything about our Christian faith. Each gospel writer, though, has their own unique way of weaving this central affirmation into the story of Easter morning. This morning we are going to continue on in Luke's gospel, where we have been for all of this year, beginning way back in the early beginnings, even before Jesus' birth. And we're going to hear Luke's particular telling of Easter morning. Now, you may remember way back in the beginning, in the first verses of Luke, in chapter 1, Luke writes this. He says, after investigating everything carefully, and he's writing to someone called Theophilus, he said he is set out to write an orderly account. Now, some say because of that, Luke is the Presbyterian gospel. He's doing it decently and in order. But Luke is also unique in the fact that there are two parts, really, to his gospel. He has the Gospel of Luke, and then what we call the Acts of the Apostles is really part 2 of the gospel, which we don't get from any other of the writers. And so when we come to this last chapter of the gospel, chapter 24 this morning, in some ways we're really just in the middle of the story, because there's a whole nother book, a whole nother chapter, long chapters that will continue. And so the resurrection for Luke is not the end of the story. In some ways, it's the pivot point. It is the fulcrum around which the whole narrative flows. So there's much to come after the story of the resurrection. Now, our text this morning is the first 12 verses of chapter 24. And it features a group of women who were followers of Jesus. And Luke follows all the other Gospels in that the women were the first one at the tomb on Easter morning. But Luke's telling is a little bit different because preceding this in chapter 23, he tells us twice that these are the women who have followed him since Galilee. And that means that they are long-term, dedicated, and loyal disciples of Jesus. They didn't just show up. They've been there through the long, dangerous road from Galilee to Jerusalem and through his passion and his crucifixion. They have witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus. They've seen him laid in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea on Friday. And then they go to get spices and ointments to prepare his body. They wait through the long Sabbath day of Saturday, and now on Sunday morning, in the deep dawn, we join the story again. If you want to follow along, you can find the reading on your insert. as we read from Luke chapter 12. Let's listen again for God's word. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they, meaning the women, they went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. And while they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified, and they bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to the hands of sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, Mary the mother of Jesus, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. And then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In one of his novels, the author John Updike tells a story about a minister named Clint Tidwell. He's a pastor of a church in a small southern town. Now, one of the blessings of his ministry, but also one of the curses, is that in his congregation was the 80-year-old owner of a local newspaper. He's very active and present in Clint Tidwell's church. The blessing part was that the old journalist believed that Clint Tidwell was one of the finest preachers around, and he wanted the whole town to benefit, so he would publish a summary of his sermon every Monday morning in the local newspaper. The curse part of this was that the newspaperman, though he was well-meaning, was a bit on the eccentric side, and as a result, Clint Tidwell was often astonished to read on Monday morning what his sermon was about. The difference between what he thought he said on Sunday and what the editor heard and published on Monday was often a source both of amazement and embarrassment. But the man owned the newspaper. He was a faithful church member. There wasn't a lot that Clint could do about this. However, his greatest embarrassment, his greatest amazement came not only when the newspaperman misunderstood the Sunday sermon, but instead when he understood it all too clearly. So it was early on Monday morning following Easter, and Clint Tidwell, in his bathrobe and his slippers, went out to retrieve the morning paper, as he did every day. The paper was lying there at the end of his driveway, and as he approached, he could see that the morning headline was in huge 2-inch size type, the one usually reserved for momentous, world-changing events. And he wondered, what could this be? Has war broken out and I didn't know about it? Has there been a cure for cancer found? What could possibly be going on that's so important? And as he drew close, he could focus on the headline, and he was startled to read these words: "Preacher Tidwell claims that Jesus Christ rose from the dead." He could hardly believe his eyes. Why was this such big news, he wondered. Yes, of course, that's what he claimed in his sermon, that Christ rose from the dead, but isn't that what you're supposed to say on Easter morning? Is that really headline news, he wondered? And suddenly, as he looked at those huge type and that headline news in the newspaper, what had been just an ordinary Easter sermon, Clint Tidwell suddenly saw in a new light. He had preached at least 24 Easter services before that. But he realized in that moment once again the incredible news, the incredible story of the resurrection. Now, I like that story because it reminds us that in the midst of all of the excitement on Sunday morning, all the wonderful music that we hear and the hymns that we sing and the beautiful flowers, all the events that go on Easter, that sometimes it's easy to forget what an outrageous event we are gathering here to celebrate. Somehow this story that we've probably heard and sung so many times over the years, that Jesus Christ is risen, has become commonplace and ordinary. We forget that the central claim of Easter Sunday is that a man who was dead is now alive again. And he's not just revived from a coma or resuscitated, but rather he was dead and is again alive and among us. Who in their right mind would believe such an outrageous story? Well, Luke tells us that the first followers of Jesus didn't quite believe it either, at least when they first heard it at the beginning. In fact, they thought the end had come with Jesus' death. They had seen him crucified and laid in a tomb. These are the same women and men, of course, who had been with Jesus throughout his ministry. They had witnessed his miracles firsthand. They had heard his teachings. They knew everything about him, but they still did not quite get it. In fact, the male disciples, the apostles, call this an idle tale. Another way of translating that in the Greek is that it was nonsense. It simply could not be believed. But let's take a little closer look at what's going on in this story to help us understand. Now, at the end of chapter 23, we are told once again that the third day had dawned, that Jesus had died, and that his followers were in effect in hiding. The men were off somewhere, not near the tomb, not drawing attention to themselves, and the women were being faithful. They were loyal to Jesus, and they knew they had to care for him. But they were going there expecting to find a corpse in the tomb. And so when they approached with their spices and their ointments, they didn't come seeking a living body or a resurrected Christ. They were going to prepare Jesus for burial as a way of respect for all the time they had spent with him. They thought that death was the final victory, and why would they think anyone else? It's hard to blame them, of course, for that expectation. Who in their right mind would expect Jesus to actually be alive? After all, there must be a limit to what God can do. There must be something beyond which we cannot believe that God would not invite us to. There's an old story told about the Straits of Gibraltar, which you probably know is that narrow channel of water that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. On each side of the straits are there mountains that are called the Pillars of Hercules. Tradition says that there's a Latin phrase that was carved into one of those pillars that was ne plus ultra, which means, translated in English, that means no more beyond. It was marking the edge of the known world to those who were in Europe, because they didn't think there was anything past that space. The phrase was adopted as a warning to sailors to go no further, that they had reached the limits of their exploration, that there was nothing else beyond. But of course, we know today that that warning was, in fact, incorrect, that there was much more beyond the barrier, that warning sign there at the Straits of Gibraltar. In fact, there was a whole world out there, a world that was already filled with people and with cultures for thousands of years. They were unseen but unimagined beyond the seen by the European people, because they hadn't stepped beyond that barrier. Something unexpected was beyond their limited human sight. And in many ways, that's what the story of Easter and the resurrection of Jesus is all about. that is proclaiming that there is indeed something more out there. There is life beyond death, that there's something beyond the limits of our human knowledge and human understanding. In Luke's Gospel, we read that two Marys in Joanna go to the tomb on Sunday morning, and there they are shocked to find that it is empty, that the body is gone. Not imagining that there was more to the story, they didn't know what else to do, and they came expecting the worst. But then their shock, we're told, is turned to terror as there are two men, two figures in these dazzling clothes, angels, messengers from God, who suddenly appear at the tomb. And they ask this probing question that is unique to Luke's Gospel. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. And these messengers, of course, proclaim the ultimate good news, that there is something beyond the world that we know and experience. That while we often search among the graveyards of our world for something of meaning and of life, Jesus is calling us beyond that to a whole new way of life. And so we celebrate at Easter. We proclaim and we sing hymns because at the foundation of our Christian faith is the claim that the resurrection of Jesus changes everything, that even death is defeated. It is the beginning of a new reign of God on earth. And so when we hear the words of the prophet Isaiah that Sharon shared with us a few moments ago, that's giving us a glimpse of what this new world, this new reign looks like. Isaiah, in effect, is saying, this is what happens when God's vision pushes beyond the limits of our human understanding. There is, he says, a new heaven and a new earth that is created, a place where the lamb and the wolf will lie down together, where there will be joy and rejoicing, and no one will be hurt or destroyed on God's holy mountain. And so Luke's story of a resurrection of Jesus tells us that there is something more. It's a promise that when we're content to settle down with death, that God brings new life into our midst. That when we seek the living among the dead, God sends us back out into the world, reminding us that Jesus is alive again. That when we set boundaries and limits on what we think we can do as individuals and as a community, when we say there is nothing more, Jesus calls us to follow into new life. And so what we hear in Luke's gospel is for those women who were first there at the tomb, suddenly that wall of disbelief falls, and the reality of the resurrection dawns on them. And the messengers then give them a command. Did you notice what they said? They said, remember. Remember how he told you. Remember how he told you this was going to happen. Remember all the deeds and all the things that he did in your journey with him. And with those words, with that command to remember, suddenly a whole new world opens up to them. They remember Jesus' words and his actions. And in remembering, their terror turns to joy, their unbelief turns to faith, and in doing so, they turn and they run. They go and they tell the rest of the women the good news. And they are, in fact, the first Christian witnesses, the first evangelists are these women who hear the good news. That Jesus they thought was dead is now alive. That the story is not over, that there is something more for us to see. This morning when we come and gather together in worship here on this Sunday morning, on this Easter Sunday, we come and I think we stand together in the company with those women who came on that first Easter morning. Like them, perhaps we also are filled with confusion and doubt and fear. We also stand together with those first apostles, dismissing the story of the women as an idle tale, as nonsense. And so we're reminded this morning that if we have a difficult time trying to absorb this story of the resurrection into our own faith experience, then we are in good company. Faith in the resurrection is not something that happens instantaneously. There is no lightning rod of sudden belief in this story. But rather, faith in the resurrection comes through the struggle with confusion, being perplexed and doubting and not fully understanding. In many ways, it's like being there at the dawn when the light first begins to show around us what everything is and we can see again. The news of the resurrection this morning was dismissed by the closest disciples of Jesus as an idle tale. But ultimately that is overcome, and they begin to believe, and the power that will change the world begins to dawn on that first morning. When we leave the sanctuary this morning after this service, we return to a world in which, in many ways, this story has been forgotten. It certainly probably is no longer headline news for most of us. We return to a world that also has its limits and its boundaries. A world that tells us again and again that there is nothing more than that which we can accumulate in our lives. It tells us that only that which we can see and hear and touch is real. It is a world we know filled with misinformation and disinformation. And this morning, today, we are reminded to remember the good news, to remember the truth, that there is more, that the resurrection of Jesus says God can make anything possible, that nothing is beyond believing. But like the disciples before us, like both the men and the women, we should understand this, that it can be frightening to take that next step of faith. But the power of the resurrection tells us that it is already out there in front of us. Jesus has gone ahead to do the work that we are called to do. And so we hear again the message, He is not here, He is risen. This is no idle tale, friends. This is headline news. To God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.